Hello everybody and welcome to today's session at Define Tomorrow on disaster recovery in the cloud using Azure Site Recovery with me, Tom Button. Quick introduction from me. I'm a senior cloud pre-sales engineer working for Inti, an indirect CSP that partners with both Microsoft and ComputerWorld. I hope you're enjoying the event so far, so thank you to ComputerWorld for putting on such a fantastic event. And on today's session, if anything I discuss is of interest to you or your wider team, feel free to reach out to the ComputerWorld team and they'll be more than happy to conduct conversations, workshops, webinars, whatever that looks like around any of the topics which we speak about in the next 20 minutes, half an hour or so. So let's jump straight in. So the agenda today, what are we going to look at? So we're going to look at disaster recovery kind of introduction initially. We'll then talk about recovery plans. We'll then talk about Azure Site Recovery itself as a workload in Azure, what it can do, what the benefits are, and then we'll look at ASR, so Azure Site Recovery, versus Azure Backup, primarily because I have conversations with partners and their customers on a daily basis, and there tends to be a little bit of confusion around which solution is potentially more suited to what they're trying to do. So we'll try and give some clarity on that today. We'll then cover off some frequently asked questions around the solution, and then we'll wrap up with some final considerations. Okay, so from an introduction perspective, I won't go into full detail and give a massive background and history on what disaster recovery is, as I'm sure the majority of people attending this webinar are aware as to what that is. But just to give a quick overview, if you're not sure or if you do want some clarity, disaster recovery, or DR, essentially enables the recovery or continuation of IT infrastructure as a result of either a planned event such as a test or an unplanned event such as a natural disaster. So let's say your data center is hit by an extreme weather condition, which results in a data center failure. With no business continuity and DR in place, your organization would no longer be functional. You'd essentially lose all of your digital capabilities, right? But with disaster recovery, or DR as we like to call it, in place, in the event of one of those failures, whether that's planned or unplanned, your IT infrastructure would fail over or move to another location to keep your business up and running, which is the most important thing, right? Interestingly, and you can see this here on screen, around 93% of companies without a disaster recovery plan who suffer a major data disaster are out of business within 1 year, which is quite a shocking statistic when you think about it. Now, when you factor that alongside that most businesses are pretty much unable to afford any kind of downtime, by leveraging Azure, you can rapidly build a resilient solution that ensures your services remain online. And that's the most important thing in this case, right? And there's a number of services available to us that can do just that. And we're primarily going to talk about Azure Site Recovery today, but it is just one single component of your entire business continuity and DR solution, okay? So we'll talk about backup and so on later, but obviously you've got high availability and all that wonderful stuff to consider as well. But that's where building a suitable recovery plan is vital, and we'll come onto that now. So contrary to popular belief, I guess, applications hosted in the cloud generally, not just Azure, they're not 100% foolproof, right? Failures do happen. And I know you've probably seen on the Microsoft website and so on, the 99.99% uptime and so on, but ultimately this isn't 100%. And since downtime can be disastrous for your business, you need a well-defined DR strategy to be able to be prepared to handle failures. But ultimately that strategy is going to be your own decision, whether that's made by your internal IT team, whether that's made in conjunction with ComputerWorld. You need to have this in place. And this will typically comprise of a number of bespoke components and considerations that, for example, will determine what resiliency you need, like your RPO and your RTO requirements, which are your recovery time objectives and your recovery points objectives, which both answer the question of, how much time will it take me and my business to recover our workloads after an outage. Now, to give you an example, I guess, every organization that I speak to will say, we need everything running 24/7 with zero downtime across every single workload that they either host on-prem or in Azure, which, is more than doable, of course. However, there is a much larger cost associated to this, especially when we're talking about high availability versus DR or disaster recovery and backup, so kind of Azure backup. When realistically, there may only be one or two applications that are required to be running all the time as mission critical as such. Let's say you have a server which is running your customer facing website, which is your point of sale. Then I would fully understand that you want high availability and full disaster recovery and all the bells and whistles for this workload. However, let's say you have a print server, which is just essentially going to be used for your employees to print off documents, pieces of paper, whatever that looks like. Do you really need full high availability in DR on this product, or could your business cope with 12, maybe 24 hours worth of downtime just by simply using something like Azure Backup or maybe a third-party backup solution? And it's only typically when you start to put costs in front of customers that the ultimate decision maker then typically turns around and says, oh yeah, you're right, perhaps we don't need everything running 24/7 using high availability, but we could look at something like Azure Site Recovery or Azure Backup, for example. It's also worth noting that there are many factors that impact the RPO for your business, and it will vary with each application. So, some of those are, maximum tolerable data loss, industry-specific standards. So, are you a business which is dealing with sensitive information? Are you dealing with financial transactions, financial history, health records, and so on? And from a costing perspective, I guess, the cost of data loss to your business and the cost to your business of those lost operations, but also just the cost of implementing a highly available solution versus a DR solution or as a backup solution or as all three combined. So if we revert our attention back to a recovery plan itself, what should you be doing here? What is it? And what should you be creating in Azure or working with Computerworld to create in Azure? Okay, so what does a recovery plan actually do? From a DR perspective, it will essentially gather machines into recovery groups for the purpose of the failover, and will help you to define a recovery process by creating smaller kind of independent units that you can then fail over. So it will let you define how machines fail over and the sequence in which they start after a failover. They can be used for both failover to and fail back from Azure. You can protect up to 100 instances, which can be added to one recovery plan. And you can, I guess, finally, you can customize the plan. You can add orders, instructions, and tasks to it as well. But why would you use a recovery plan? So, from my perspective, you would use a recovery plan to run a test failover, to model an app around its dependencies, to automate recovery tasks, to reduce that RTO, which we just spoke about, and to essentially verify you've even prepared for a migration if that's the route that you're going down, as opposed to using it for DR purposes. And if you are using it to test a migration, there's a number of best practices to follow. But the main kind of 2 or 3 for me are, always completing a test failover before running a full failover, or actually, in that matter, a few test failovers, which will essentially even help you check whether the app comes up on the recovery side. And as apps and their dependencies obviously change frequently, as I'm sure potentially being a member of an IT team, to ensure recovery plans are kept up to date, I would run a test failover for each app, I mean, maximum kind of once every quarter, maybe once every month, potentially even more frequent. And there's obviously a number of other considerations as well, but without going into too much detail, that should provide you with enough information to understand what a recovery plan is and why it's important. And yeah, I mean, again, a recovery plan is important, but it also relates to site recovery. So you'll actually you need to consider what solution is right for you, and we'll come on to Azure Site Recovery versus backup later. But, outside of those two Azure related products, you've also got high availability to consider as well. You might, in fact, want to run two environments alongside each other. So, if we take a workload, for example, like a domain controller, typically, I mean, I wouldn't run ASR and backup on a single domain controller running in an environment. I would typically always have two domain controllers running, one in one region, one in another, because realistically, you don't want your identity solution going down. Okay, so it does depend on a workload by workload basis. But again, working with Computer World, having those conversations with an MSP, which is competent in what they're doing from an Azure perspective, having worked with multiple customers, that consultative piece around what is right for you, what is right for your business, is going to be completely invaluable when considering which route to take. Okay. So if we move on to the topic at hand, so Azure Site Recovery is a product. So what is Azure Site Recovery used for? Okay, so it's used to replicate your workloads from the primary site, which could be on-premise or in Azure, to a secondary location. And if an outage happens, you can use your disaster recovery plan and ASR, or Azure Site Recovery, to fail over to that secondary location, meaning your business can keep working, which we spoke about in the introduction at the beginning. And then ultimately, when the primary location comes back up and running again, you can then fail back to your primary location. Okay, so it will protect Windows and Linux-based computers, physical servers, VMware, and Hyper-V also. It also integrates well with applications like SharePoint, Exchange, Dynamics, SQL Server, and Active Directory, amongst a number of others as well. And in terms of the benefits to AR, now, obviously there's quite a few solutions on the market and products available to you to design a DR solution. However, I mean, from my perspective, ASR has quite a few advantages. The first one being its lower cost compared to other solutions which are available in the market. It's really easy to deploy and configure. There's no need to install any complex tools and additional third-party software. It's a managed service offering as well from Microsoft, meaning all the underlying infrastructure, all the underlying infrastructure components are managed by Microsoft. So there's no management overhead from your perspective, either from a manual having to manage, patch, update, maintain the solution, or adding additional components from a commercial standpoint as well. It supports a wide variety of scenarios, so you can either replicate your workload from pretty much anywhere, to be fair, to Azure. So the source location could be another Azure region, it could be an on-premise data center, it could be AWS, and so on. It supports replication of Azure VMs, Azure Stack VMs, AWS VMs, VMware VMs, Hyper-V VMs, and also physical servers. So pretty much anything that you can possibly think of realistically. And I think the big thing for me is that if the final destination is Azure, then your organization does not need to invest a huge amount of money on the secondary location setup and maintenance, meaning ultimately that there is no requirement to replicate your entire infrastructure to a secondary location and to have that running alongside in parallel 24/7, 365 days a year. I mean, especially from a commercial standpoint, if we look at ASR, from a commercial standpoint, you're essentially paying for ASR, the license, until a failure occurs, at which point you'll then be paying for the additional compute resources and the storage and so on top in that secondary location but that's not until a failure occurs. So you're not paying for those servers, for those storage accounts and so on to be running permanently alongside. They will only spin up once you initiate that failover. Okay, and the cost of that is far less. Okay, so in terms of how it works, when you're going through the process of enabling replication, there's a few things that you'd want to consider, a few things that you want to plan to take into consideration, and these can all be dealt with within the Azure portal. So, the target location, so the location where your source virtual machine data will be replicated to, your target subscription, so multiple subscriptions are often prevalent in many customers. You won't just have one Azure subscription, you might have multiple Azure subscriptions, maybe per cost center, per location, per department potentially. So having the subscription set up correctly is pivotal. Your target resource groups, again, similar to subscriptions. So the resource group to which all of your replicated virtual machines belong. And on that note as well, actually, Site Recovery will create a new resource group in that target region for you. And if the resource group already exists, it will essentially just be reused. And lastly, on that point as well, actually, the location of the target resource group can be any Azure region, except the region where the source VMs are hosted. So last couple of points on that. So your target virtual network. So by default, Site Recovery will create a new virtual network in the target region, which is mapped to your source network. And then the last point is the target storage accounts as well, so both for managed and unmanaged disks. Another point on kind of how it works, actually, and this is something I have to answer the question to quite frequently, is out of the box, ASR won't automatically fail over. You can make that happen, and we'll talk about that in the frequently asked questions piece at the end. However, out of the box, it is a manual failover process, i.e. clicking the button to failover, okay? And I know it sounds complex, but it's really not, and that's the beauty of it, and it's pretty straightforward in terms of DR generally anyway, to be honest with you, but regardless of its complexity, this is where your partnership with Computer World is vital. They're experienced in Azure deployments, working with customers of all shapes and sizes, so if you want to have that discussion around building out a recovery plan, the solution itself, how it compares to other products, what's right for you and the place that your business is in now, just reach out to them and let them know, and they'll be more than happy to have that conversation with you. Okay. So now we've spoken about ASR, let's look at ASR versus Azure Backup. So Azure Site Recovery versus Azure Backup. As I said before, this is a topic and a conversation that I have quite frequently. So what's the difference? Which one should you choose, and what's the pros and cons of each? So I guess starting from the top, if high availability is beyond your budget, a disaster recovery solution is your next option. Okay, so using ASR, should an unplanned incident take down, or a planned incident, take down a single server or your entire primary infrastructure, you can rapidly spin up your Azure VMs and have your services back up online in, the key point being here, a few minutes using ASR. Okay, whereas from my perspective, backups form that almost, how to best put it, that last line of defense, and they're the foundational component for any data protection strategy. So when all else fails, you can restore your systems and recover your data, but with a lower RTO. So let's say 12 hours a day, versus the minutes that we just spoke about on ASR. Okay. So with that in mind, so with an overview in mind, which should you choose? Azure Backup or Azure Site Recovery? And to be honest, I think from my perspective anyway, these should not be thought of as competing products, rather that they are complementary. Azure Backup allows for granular backups and restores specific data, whereas Azure Site Recovery allows for the protection of an entire production site with automation and orchestration to make the failover and the failback process as quick and seamless as possible. So they're very different solutions, I guess you could say, but working together, they make a fully robust business continuity and DR solution without considering HA anyway. So a few points to consider, I guess, when we're talking about data backup and retention. Azure Backup allows for much more granular backup and retention policies as well compared to ASR. So also for very specific data restores, Azure Backup is the solution that would allow for this. And when using ASR, the RPOs can dramatically be reduced, okay? And the reason for that is that it provides continuous or extremely low replication intervals between the source and the replica copies in Azure, okay? And wrapping this section up, ultimately it comes down to choosing the right tool for you and the right tool for the job and your user case at the moment, okay? Both products provide the needed functionality in protecting individual workloads as well as protecting workloads at site level. But and I appreciate that this is kind of a very high level overview as to both products, but again, I've mentioned this a few times. If you do want further clarity, if you do want costings around which product is going to cost more, which product is going to cost less, how much they would cost in conjunction with each other, speak to Computer World and they will advise you in the best direction for your business. Okay. And there's quite a few frequently asked questions that we get with regards to ASR. So I just thought I would reel a few of those off right now. So is failover automatic using ASR? So failover isn't out of the box automatic, as I mentioned. You initiate failovers with a single click in the portal, or you can use Site Recovery PowerShell to trigger a failover. If you want to automate, you could use an on-premise orchestrator or operations manager to detect virtual machine failover, and then you could trigger the failover using an SDK. But yeah, out of the box, it is a manual process. What does ASR do to ensure data integrity? So what does Site Recovery do to ensure data integrity? So there are various measures taken by Site Recovery to ensure this. Secure connection is established between all services by using the HTTPS protocol. This essentially makes sure that any malware or any outside entities can't tamper with the data. Or lastly, actually on that as well, a measure is taken using checksums as well, so that all the data transferred is consistent. If I'm replicating to Azure, do we need to run virtual machines in Azure at all times? No. So as we spoke about before, this is one of the huge commercial benefits, right? The data is replicated to Azure in storage within that subscription, okay? So when you perform a test failover or an actual failover, Site Recovery will automatically create those virtual machines in your subscription for you, and you'll then begin paying for them on a pay-as-you-go basis. Okay, so they're not going to be running in the background all the time. Is replication data sent to Site Recovery services? No, so Site Recovery doesn't intercept any replicated data and doesn't have any information about what's running on your virtual machines or your physical servers. Only the metadata needed to orchestrate the replication and failover is sent to the Site Recovery service. It's also worth noting, actually, that Site Recovery is ISO, HIPAA, and DPA certified, amongst others as well. So you've got that industry standard backing as well. For compliance reasons, even our on-premise metadata must remain within the same geographic region. Can Site Recovery do this? Yes. So when you create a Site Recovery vault in a region, Microsoft will ensure that all of that metadata remains within the region's geographic boundaries. Okay, so you've got that confidence there. Does Site Recovery encrypt all replication? Yeah, so for virtual machines and physical servers replicating between on-premise sites, encryption in transit is supported. For workloads replicating to Azure, both encryption in transit and encryption at rest are supported. Can I move the recovery services vaults across subscriptions? No. It doesn't support the move of vaults that have protected virtual machines hosted in it. Can I replicate over a site-to-site VPN to Azure? So the way it works is that ASR replicates data to an Azure storage account or managed disks over a public endpoint. So replication isn't over a site-to-site VPN, but you can use ExpressRoute, however. So yeah, you can use ExpressRoute, but it's not over a VPN. If I replicate to Azure, what kind of storage account or managed disk do I need? So using storage accounts as target storage is basically not supported using ASR. It's recommended to use managed disks as the target storage for all of your machines. Okay. How far back can I recover? So the oldest recovery point that you can use is 72 hours. A couple of questions left. So I have a replication policy of 24 hours. What will happen if a problem prevents site recovery from generating recovery points for more than 24 hours? Will my previous recovery points be lost? No is the short answer. So site recovery will keep all of your previous recovery points, and depending on the recovery points retention window, it will essentially replace the oldest point only if it generates new points, basically. If I'm failing over to Azure, how do I access the Azure VMs after a failover? So you can access them over a secure internet connection, over a site-to-site VPN, or over an Azure Express route. Okay. And final considerations for me. I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it's important to note that when you're considering business continuity and DR generally, it's important that you understand the difference between fully highly available solutions, disaster recovery, and backup. Now, I know that this session has been primarily focused on ASR as a product, but if you want to discuss how to keep your business secure and available at all times, or discussing any of the products which we've spoken about today, I'd recommend just reaching out to ComputerWorld. As I've mentioned, they've worked with numerous customers of all different shapes and sizes, and we have conversations with them all the time around those customers and what they're looking to do from a business continuity and DR perspective. So reach out to ComputerWorld, and they'll help you with designing and discussing which solution is going to be best to aid your organization in ultimately achieving your goals. But that's it from me today. I hope this session's been beneficial for you to understand Azure Site Recovery, Azure Site Recovery versus backup as well. And enjoy the rest of the event, and hopefully speak to you soon. Take care.